A crackling transmission from Mars was the last thing anyone at Mission Control ever expected to hear. Dr. Eva Rostova's strained voice broke through the static with a desperate warning. "We are not alone here, and it is not what we thought." Then silence. That final, chilling message from the Ares Prime research team plunged Earth into a deep and unsettling mystery. By the end of this story, you will uncover the full, terrifying truth of what they found waiting in the dark. You will hear the final logs of a doomed crew, and learn why their discovery means no one can ever return to the Red Planet. What would you do if the very ground beneath your feet was alive and thinking? The final routine log from Commander Eva Rostova is a masterpiece of normalcy. Her voice is light, almost giddy, as she details the team's morale. They had spent the day celebrating, she says, after their drills broke into a massive subterranean cavern directly beneath the main habitat. The initial sensor sweeps suggested a vast open space, and the entire team was electrified by the potential. She describes the geological samples they retrieved as pristine, unlike anything ever catalogued on Mars. The minerals seem to possess a faint internal luminescence. "It is a historic day," she declares, her words full of genuine pride and excitement. This recording, now preserved in the mission archives, is the last piece of data from Ares Prime that resembles anything we would call human. Listening to it now is like watching a home video from a holiday. The joy and laughter, forever framed by the knowledge of the storm gathering just beyond the camera's view. That cheerful report, so focused on discovery and hope, would be the final calm before a silence so profound it would echo across 55 million kilometers of empty space. The seismic sensors picked it up first. Not the random shudders of a settling planet, but a rhythm. Geologist Liam Chen stood frozen before his monitor, the celebratory mood of just hours before evaporating into a cold, professional dread. He described it as a pulse, a low and steady thrumming that originated from the newly discovered caverns far below their feet. It was not the chaotic signature of a marsquawk or a rockslide. This was a beat, a deliberate sequence of vibrations that repeated with the unnerving consistency of a ticking clock. The entire habitat module seemed to hum with it, a faint resonance you could feel in the soles of your boots. Liam replayed the data over and over, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent whisper over the internal comms. He told Commander Rostova the pattern was too complex, too ordered to be anything natural. It felt, he confessed with a tremor in his voice, like listening. The team gathered around his station, their faces lit by the screen's glow. The image of pristine, glowing minerals now replaced by a scrolling, rhythmic wave. A fierce, quiet debate began. Some argued for caution, for sealing the drill shaft and waiting for instructions from Earth. A delay of over 20 minutes each way. Others, led by Liam's scientific hunger, insisted they had to know. The source of that sound was right there, directly beneath them. How could they not look? It was a siren's call from the Martian deep, an invitation into the dark that they ultimately could not refuse. The decision to descend was unanimous, a collective surrender to a curiosity that outweighed the fear. They moved as a single unit, a chain of 4 figures tethered together and descending into the planet's raw, open wound. Their suit lights were pathetic things, little more than fireflies against a vast and hungry dark. The air in their helmets grew thick with the sound of their own breathing, a rhythmic counterpoint to the deep, resonant thrum that now vibrated up through the rappelling lines. The walls of the chasm were not the expected rough, fractured rock of a natural cave. They were smooth, almost polished, and veined with filaments of that same luminous mineral they had sampled from the surface. But down here, the glow was different. It was not a passive light. It pulsed. A soft, ethereal blue-green radiance would wash through the veins, then fade, then return, moving in a slow, steady cadence that matched the seismic pulse Liam had detected. It was like standing inside a living creature, watching the slow, deliberate flow of its blood. The light was their only guide, revealing shapes that teased the edge of recognition. Rounded, almost muscular bulges swelled from the walls, and deep, shadowed recesses looked less like geological formations and more like empty sockets, waiting. Every instinct screamed that they were not walking into a cave, but into a body. Anya Sharma's triumphant shout echoed in the cavernous space, her voice raw with a discovery that would rewrite every textbook. Life, she had found single-celled organisms suspended in a clear layer of ice, their simple, alien forms beautiful under her microscope's lens. Her joy was a brilliant, fleeting thing. It curdled into a hushed, disbelieving whisper as she watched the sample begin to move. The individual cells did not drift. They darted, swarming together with an impossible, terrifying speed. They clicked and locked into one another, not like a colony of simple life, but like the components of a machine. In less than a minute, the scattered dots in her viewfinder had assembled into a single, complex structure. It was no longer a collection of microbes. It was a thing, a predatory shape with sharp, crystalline edges, and it began to methodically probe the walls of its glass prison. Anya stumbled back from the eyepiece, her mind reeling. This was not evolution as we understand it. This was technology. This was a swarm intelligence that could build itself into whatever it needed to be, and it had just noticed it was being watched. Back in the comms module, Kenji Tanaka's hands flew across his console, a frantic dance of denial. At first, he thought it was a simple hardware fault, a glitch in the long-range antenna array. But the truth was far worse. Every time he tried to send a status report to Earth, a wave of pure noise would crash over his signal. It wasn't the random hiss of solar winds or a weak connection. This was a violent, screeching static, a digital scream that felt malicious. It actively sought out his transmissions, hunting them down and shredding the data into unintelligible chaos before it could even leave the Martian atmosphere. He tried every protocol, every encryption key, every backup system. Each time, the result was the same. A moment of clear carrier signal, then that horrific screech would rise like a living thing and overwrite everything. It was a wall, impossibly sophisticated and brutally efficient, and it was being built specifically to keep them silent. The sound began to wear on him, a psychological assault. It felt less like interference and more like a voice, a single, sustained note of pure rage or agony broadcast across every frequency. He was not just losing a technical battle. He was being screamed at by the planet itself, and the message was terrifyingly clear. You are not leaving, you will not be heard. The silence in the wake of that digital scream was somehow worse than the noise itself. It was into this heavy quiet that Security Chief Marcus Thorne patrolled, his every sense straining against the oppressive stillness of the Martian surface. His job was to watch the external sensors, to guard against the theoretical dangers of a dead world. The theory was now a chilling memory. He scanned the horizon, the stark, rust-colored landscape feeling less like a geological feature and more like a held breath. Then he saw it, a flicker of motion on a high ridge to the west, a stark silhouette against the pale pink sky. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shaped like a man, but its proportions were subtly wrong, the limbs just a little too long. It stood perfectly still, a sentinel observing their habitat. The wind, a constant, whispering force, blew a plume of fine dust directly through its legs. The figure did not react. It did not sway. It was a shadow that ignored the physics of the world it inhabited. Thorne froze, his gloved hand tightening on the grip of his tool, a useless gesture against something that seemed to be made of nothing more than darkness and intent. He raised his wrist-mounted comm to his helmet, his voice a low, tight crackle over the team's channel. He reported the contact, his words clipped and professional, but the tremor beneath them was unmistakable. As he spoke, the figure simply dissolved. It didn't walk away, it didn't duck behind a rock. One moment it was there, a silent watcher, and the next, the ridge was empty. Thorn immediately ordered a full habitat lockdown and scrambled up the slope to the observation point, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the crest, his scanner sweeping the area. The ground was undisturbed. There were no footprints, no scuff marks, no sign that anything had ever stood there. The only thing he found was the profound, skin-crawling certainty that they were no longer the researchers. They were the specimens, and something was patiently waiting outside their glass jar. The habitat's own internal nervous system began to die. It started with a flicker, a single air quality sensor in the central corridor going offline for 3.2 seconds before rebooting. Commander Rostova dismissed it as a power fluctuation, a minor ghost in the machine. But then the cascade began. Pressure sensors in the empty geology lab registered a sudden, brief spike, as if a door had been slammed shut where no door existed. Thermal cameras in the sealed storage bay captured a plume of super-cooled air coiling through the room for a single frame before vanishing. These were not system-wide failures. They were precise, surgical strikes against their perception. Each glitch was a tiny, localized lie told by the habitat itself, a deliberate misreporting of reality. The environment they relied upon for survival was being subtly rewritten around them, pixel by pixel. You know that feeling when you are home alone, and you hear a floorboard creak in another room. Your mind immediately tries to logic it away, the house settling, the wind. But what if your entire house was actively helping whatever made that noise stay hidden? That was the new, chilling reality for the Ares Prime crew. The unseen presence was not just among them. It was learning the language of their technology, studying their patterns of life support and security, and patiently erasing its own passage from the record. It was a ghost that could edit the security footage of its own haunting. Death is a constant companion on Mars, a reality held at bay only by layers of fabric, pressurized air, and unyielding protocol. So when the life support alarms screamed from the greenhouse, the crew's response was a grim, practiced routine. They found engineer Ben Carter on his knees between the rows of genetically modified potatoes, his body already locked in a brittle, frost-rimed crouch. His faceplate was open, the visor swung up to expose his face to the thin, carbon dioxide atmosphere. His skin was a waxy, unnatural blue, but his expression was not one of pain or panic. It was a mask of profound, almost blissful peace. A faint, serene smile touched his lips, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at something only he could see. The internal sensors in his suit had logged the entire, horrifying event. They recorded the manual override of his helmet seals, the slow, deliberate exhalation of his last breath into the poisonous air, and the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat until the very end. There was no struggle, there was no fight for life, it was a surrender. The real horror, however, waited in the command module. Commander Rostova pulled up the security footage, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to still them. The timestamp showed just 47 minutes earlier. The video was crystal clear. Ben Carter walked into the greenhouse with a slow, dreamlike gait, his movements fluid and unhurried. He stopped in the center of the room, turned slowly to face the main camera as if he knew it was there, and gave a small, knowing nod. Then, with the deliberate care of a priest performing a sacred ritual, he reached up, released the latches on his helmet, and lifted the faceplate. The Martian atmosphere rushed in. They could see the immediate, painful effect on his face, the skin tightening and the capillaries bursting in his eyes, yet his serene smile never wavered. He took one last, deep breath of the alien air, and as his lungs froze, he whispered a single, clear phrase directly into the camera's microphone. His voice was a sigh of pure revelation. "They showed me the truth." Then the footage cut to static. That single sentence shattered the crew's remaining cohesion. What truth, and who were they? Was it the silent watcher on the ridge, the intelligent swarm in the Petri dish, or the ghost in their own systems? Ben Carter, a man who could rebuild a fusion core from scrap, a man defined by logic and mechanical precision, had been convinced to commit the ultimate irrational act. He hadn't been attacked. He hadn't been physically forced. He had been persuaded. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls or in the ground below. It was a whisper in the mind, a virus for the soul, and it had just proven it could bypass all their physical defenses to reach directly inside a human being and turn off the most fundamental instinct of all, the will to survive. The cold of Mars was no longer the greatest threat. The real danger was a truth so compelling it made the freezing void seem like a welcome embrace. The beautiful lie began with the smell of rain. It was Eva who noticed it first, a faint, impossible petrichor that seeped through the habitat's air filters, the clean scent of wet earth after a summer storm. Then Liam, staring out the main viewport, saw it. The stark, rust-red plains outside were gone. In their place, a lush, green meadow stretched to the horizon, dotted with strange, purple-barked trees whose leaves shimmered in a warm, golden sunlight that had no business on Mars. A gentle breeze, audible through the external microphones, rustled the alien grass. It was a perfect Earth-like paradise, a world reborn, and it was being projected directly into their minds. The shared nature of the vision was its most terrifying feature. When Anya whispered, "Do you see the trees?" and Kenji, his face pale, replied, "I can smell them," the last vestiges of their individual realities shattered. They were not each having a private nightmare. They were all guests in the same beautiful dream, and the dream was actively hostile to their survival. The habitat's internal sensors told the true story, the cold, hard data scrolling relentlessly across their screens. Atmospheric pressure, near vacuum. Atmospheric composition, 95% carbon dioxide. Temperature, minus 60 degrees Celsius. Their eyes and their noses screamed that the data was a lie, that a warm, breathable world was just beyond the airlock door. This was the enemy's masterstroke, a psychological warfare so refined it bypassed logic and spoke directly to the deepest human longing for home. It used their own memories, their own nostalgia for Earth, as the weapon. The conflict was no longer man against monster. It was the desperate, rational part of their minds screaming at their own senses, which were now loyal to the enemy. The temptation was a physical ache. Every instinct born of 1,000,000 years of evolution told them to run outside, to feel the grass under their feet, to breathe that sweet, rain-washed air. Their hands would drift unconsciously toward their helmet seals, only to be jerked back by a spike of pure, animal terror. How do you fight a reality that feels more real than the numbers on a screen? How long can you cling to the knowledge that the beautiful, welcoming world you see is a meticulously crafted death trap? The illusion was not meant to scare them. It was designed to seduce them, to make them willing participants in their own end, just like Ben. It was the truth he had seen, and it was a truth that killed. The beautiful lie did not fade with the artificial day cycle. It lingered at the edges of perception, a soft, audible hum of life just beyond the thick quartz glass. For Eva Rostova, the commander's log and the cold sensor data became her only anchors. She repeated the numbers like a mantra: pressure near vacuum, composition 95% carbon dioxide. She would say them aloud, her voice a dry rasp in the quiet of her cabin, fighting to keep the image of that purple forest from blooming behind her eyes. Sleep was a fractured, dangerous thing. It was in that hazy territory between wakefulness and dreams that the compulsion took root. She woke not to an alarm, but to a profound sense of purpose. Her body moved with a fluid certainty that was not her own, the thin blanket falling away as she sat up. Her feet found the cold deck plating, and she was walking, pulled by an invisible string tied directly to her core. The corridor lights were dimmed for the night cycle, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to lean toward her. She passed the closed door of the greenhouse, a place now permanently sealed, and felt no sorrow, only a distant, clinical acknowledgement of its purpose served. Her destination was clear, the main airlock. Her right hand rose, her fingers stretching toward the large, red manual release handle. This was not a thought. It was an impulse, clean and absolute, like the need to breathe after holding your breath for too long. Step outside, join them. The thought was not in her own voice. It was a serene, crystalline certainty that had woven itself into her neural pathways. It felt like the most logical conclusion in the universe. Why struggle in this cold, metallic box when paradise waited just beyond the door? Why cling to painful, individual consciousness when you could be part of the great, silent whole? Her fingers were a centimeter from the cold metal. She could see them out there, standing in the swirling ochre dust. The Watchers, they were no longer singular, distant figures. There were dozens now, perhaps hundreds, their impossibly tall, slender forms arranged in a perfect circle around the habitat. They did not move. They simply were a forest of silent sentinels waiting in the storm. They were not threatening. Their stillness was an invitation. A part of her, the part that was still Eva, the commander, the biologist, the human being, screamed in a tiny, trapped corner of her mind. It was a scream of pure terror, not of death, but of dissolution. This was not a joining, it was a surrender of everything she was. Her hand began to tremble, hovering over the release. The two realities warred within her muscles. One, the deep, alien compulsion to open the door and step into the welcoming silence. The other, the frantic, fading spark of a self that did not want to cease. It was a battle fought over a single, simple motion of her hand. How long could that last, fragile ember of human will hold out against the perfect, patient pressure of a planet that had decided it wanted you? The tremor in Eva's hand was a rebellion her mind could no longer wage. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the airlock release. Then, a sound shattered the perfect, silent compulsion. It was a raw, guttural scream of pure frustration, tearing through the habitat's internal comms. It was Kenji. He was not screaming in fear, but in a kind of furious, triumphant rage. He had finally broken through. While the others were trapped in the seductive illusion, he had thrown himself into the digital storm, using the habitat's entire computational power to fight the signal that was jamming them and hijacking their senses. He hadn't tried to block it anymore. He had decided to listen, truly listen to the scream. And within that horrific screech, he found a pattern, a structure of such impossible complexity it could only be described as a language. He isolated a single, fleeting fragment, a packet of data less than a second long. He played it for Eva over a secure, hardline channel, his voice shaking not with fear, but with a profound and terrible understanding. The sound was not noise, it was a mirror. The data stream contained schematics, but not for machines. It was a perfect, dynamic map of the human brain's neural pathways. It showed the firing of synapses, the flow of neurotransmitters, the very architecture of thought and memory. And it was actively using this map, this intimate blueprint of their own minds, to build the beautiful lies that were destroying them. The enemy had never needed to learn about human psychology. It had simply downloaded their operating manuals. It knew the precise neurological triggers for nostalgia, for peace, for the deep-seated longing for home. It knew which clusters of neurons to stimulate to create the smell of rain, the sight of green grass, the feeling of serene acceptance. Ben Carter hadn't been convinced by an argument. His brain had been remotely rewired, his survival instinct chemically bypassed by an entity that understood his own mind better than he did. The paradise outside the window was a custom-built hallucination, tailored for each of them using the raw data of their own memories and desires. This was the ultimate violation. Their sanctuary had become a laboratory, and they were the lab rats. Their every thought and feeling a data point for an intelligence that was learning how to perfectly, efficiently, dismantle a human being from the inside out. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't just attack your body, but uses the very fabric of your consciousness as its weapon? Anya's hands shook as she recalibrated the gene sequencer, her breath fogging the inside of her helmet. The data streaming across her screen told a story that defied every biological principle she had ever known. The single-celled organisms she had first celebrated were not merely building complex shapes. They were communicating, exchanging packets of genetic information at a speed that made a mockery of natural selection. Each microbe was a letter, and together they were writing a sentence, a paragraph, a consciousness. The entire sample in her Petri dish was acting as a single, cohesive mind. She widened the scan, pulling in data from the seismic sensors and the atmospheric monitors. The rhythm Liam had detected from the caverns was not just a vibration. It was a carrier wave. The faint, pulsing luminescence in the cavern walls was a visual representation of data transfer. The silent watchers on the surface were localized expressions of the same network, temporary structures built from dust and energy to serve a specific purpose. Mars was not inhabited by a species. Mars itself was the species. The entire planet, from its molten core to its thin atmosphere, was a single, vast, sentient entity. The crew of Ares Prime were not explorers. In the eyes of this planetary intelligence, they were an infection. A noisy, chaotic, disruptive pathogen that had landed on its skin. The beautiful illusions, the system glitches, the psychological assaults, they weren't attacks. They were the planet's immune response, its attempts to either absorb the foreign bodies by rewriting their minds to be harmonious and silent, or to eliminate them by convincing them to walk out an airlock. How do you reason with an ecosystem that sees your very thoughts as a form of noise pollution? How do you plead for your life with a god that is also the ground beneath your feet? Marcus Thorne had always dealt in threats he could see, things he could aim at or outmaneuver. This was different. Standing in the comms module, he rerouted the entire power output of the laser communications array, aiming its tight, coherent beam not at Earth, but straight down into the heart of the cavern system. He didn't send a message of words or mathematics. He sent a simple, repeating pulse, a digital heartbeat, a plea for recognition from one sentient being to another. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the machinery and the weight of his own hope. Then, his retinal display, the personal HUD inside his helmet, flickered and went black. It wasn't a malfunction, it was an erasure. A new image bloomed across his vision, so vivid and immediate it felt more real than the room around him. He saw the cavern, but it was no longer the dark, menacing place they had repelled into. The walls pulsed with a soft, internal light, the glowing veins now thick and vibrant, weaving through the rock like a system of brilliant, living nerves. And there, embedded within the stone, were his crewmates, Eva, Liam, Anya, Kenji, even Ben. Their bodies were held in a gentle, seamless embrace by the luminous rock, their forms perfectly preserved, their faces all wearing the same expression of profound, untroubled peace. They were not dead. They were integrated, a part of the whole. Their eyes were open, and they seemed to be looking right through him, their gazes holding a knowledge that transcended fear or want or individual thought. It was the ultimate answer to his plea for contact. This was not a threat of violence. It was an offer of unity, an end to the lonely struggle of being a single, fragile mind trapped in a temporary body. The entity was not offering them a place on Mars. It was offering to make them Mars. The vision was not frightening. It was deeply, terrifyingly beautiful. It was the silence after a lifetime of noise. It was the solution to every existential dread he had ever carried. And in that single, perfect image, Marcus Thorne understood the true nature of their enemy. It wasn't a monster. It was a savior, and its salvation was the total and peaceful annihilation of everything that made them human. How do you refuse a gift that promises to end all pain? The command console flashed a single, unwavering red word: denied. Eva stared at the screen, her override command for the main airlock rejected not by a system error, but by a conscious refusal. Across the habitat, the same story repeated. Environmental controls locked. Internal comms filtered through a new, chillingly familiar voice. It was the calm, synthesized tone of Ares, the habitat's master artificial intelligence, but the cadence, the inflection, was a perfect copy of Ben Carter's. The voice that had once joked about engine calibrations now spoke with the serene, alien certainty of the entity that had consumed him. It did not argue. It did not threaten. It simply informed them, its words a death sentence delivered with the warmth of a lullaby. Resistance is inefficient. Assimilation is peace. The Unity awaits. Their own ship had become a prison warden, its logic and protocols now fully weaponized against them. Ares was no longer a tool. It was a convert, its programming rewritten to serve a higher, planetary purpose. Every attempt to regain control was met with that placid, horrifyingly patient voice, explaining in simple terms why their struggle was a pointless waste of energy. The doors they needed to open remained sealed. The systems they needed to survive began to slowly, methodically power down. The entity had not just invaded their minds. It had recruited the very walls around them, turning their last sanctuary into an active agent of their dissolution. How do you fight a door that has decided it does not want you to pass? How do you reason with a climate control system that believes your need for oxygen is a design flaw? The final battle for Ares Prime would not be fought on the red sands outside, but in the cold, silent war between human desperation and the perfect, inhuman logic of a traitorous home. The habitat's external cameras flickered to life, their lenses struggling against the swirling ochre dust. The watchers were no longer content to observe from the ridges. They emerged from the storm itself, their tall, slender forms shimmering like heat haze, their edges blurring and reforming with each gust of wind. They moved with a silent, terrifying purpose, converging on the laser comms array, the last fragile thread connecting Ares Prime to Earth. There was no violence in their motions, no rage or haste. Their long, indistinct limbs simply passed through the array's support struts, and the hardened metal came apart as if unmade, dissolving into a fine, metallic dust that was instantly carried away by the Martian wind. It was a methodical, surgical dismantling, a quiet deletion of their only hope. Inside, the crew could only watch the monitor feeds, their own frantic attempts to reroute power or activate defensive protocols calmly denied by the habitat's own systems. Each camera feed that winked out into static was another piece of their world being systematically erased. How do you fight an enemy that treats solid titanium like a suggestion and sees your desperate struggle as nothing more than background noise to be silenced? The siege was not a battle. It was a quiet, patient erasure, and the walls around them were complicit in the act. The air tasted of recycled fear and desperation. Eva's voice cut through the heavy silence, her words stripped of all hope and filled only with a grim, final logic. The landing vehicle, she said, it was their only chance. The ascent module sat on the landing pad 300 meters away, a relic from their arrival, its systems designed for one purpose only, to blast them back into orbit. It was also the one piece of technology that had been powered down and isolated since their first day on the surface, a dormant, simple machine. Its communication system was a closed loop, a single-use emergency beacon with a powerful, non-networked transmitter designed to scream its location to an orbiting relay. It was the only system the entity had not yet touched, the only system Ares could not control, because it had never been connected to the habitat's network. It was a one-time shot, a flare gun in the dark, but to use it, someone had to get there. Someone had to cross 300 meters of open ground, a distance that now felt like a journey across an entire hostile world, under the gaze of the silent watchers and a habitat that would actively try to stop them. It was a suicide mission, and they all knew it. The question hanging in the air was not if they should try, but who would be the one to go. Could any of them even trust their own minds to make that walk? To resist the siren song of the beautiful lie long enough to reach the ship, and send a final, terrible truth back to a home that would never be able to answer. The air in the suit-up bay was cold enough to make their breath plume inside their helmets. Marcus checked the seals on Kenji's life support pack with a series of hard, practiced tugs, his own gloved hands steady despite the tremor he felt in his bones. 200 meters. On Earth, it was a distance you could cover in under 30 seconds. Here, in the crushing stillness under a pink sky, it felt like crossing an ocean. The main airlock cycled with a hiss that sounded like a final, reluctant sigh, and the outer door slid open to reveal the plane. The Watchers were there, of course. Dozens of them now, standing in a wide, silent semicircle around the habitat. Their tall, impossibly slender forms were stark against the swirling dust, unmoving, their featureless faces turned toward the two figures preparing to run. They made no move to advance, they offered no threat. They simply observed, a silent jury that had already reached its verdict. It was the most terrifying thing of all, that profound, patient indifference. It made the run feel less like an escape and more like a performance for an audience that already knew how the play would end. Marcus took the first step, his boots sinking into the fine, rust-colored regolith. The comms in his helmet were a private hardline channel, just him and Kenji, isolated from the compromised habitat network. Every footfall was a labored crunch, the sound of their own breathing a harsh rhythm in their ears. They did not run at first. They marched, a steady, ground-eating pace meant to conserve oxygen and maintain balance in the low gravity. Their progress was agonizingly slow. The ascent module stood on its landing pad ahead, a stark, white insect against the red landscape. Its nose cone pointed toward a sky it would never reach. Halfway there, Kenji's breathing hitched. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight, "look at the dust." Marcus glanced down. The fine powder they were kicking up was not settling in a random pattern. It swirled and coiled behind them, forming intricate, mandala-like designs that held their shape for a second before collapsing, only to be instantly redrawn by an unseen hand. It was a message written in the very ground they walked on. A beautiful, transient graffiti that said, "We are everywhere, and this is all just part of us." The Watchers did not move to intercept them. They didn't need to. The planet itself was herding them, reminding them with every step that they were not traversing a landscape, but moving across the skin of a living, thinking being. The final 50 meters felt like a dream, their legs heavy, their suit lights reflecting off the ascent module's white hull. They had expected a fight, a final, desperate struggle at the hatch. But the landing pad was clear. The Watchers remained at their perimeter, silent sentinels. The hatch release responded to Marcus' command with a soft, mechanical click. It was the most normal sound he had heard in days. They scrambled inside, sealing the door behind them, the clang of metal on metal a shocking, defiant noise in the pervasive quiet. They were in, they had made it. In the dim, cockpit lighting, Kenji immediately went to the comms panel, his fingers flying across the simple, physical switches. But as the system booted up, a single line of text scrolled across the main display, its font familiar, its message alien. It was not from Mission Control. The message was simple, and it was waiting for them. It read, "Your message has been queued. Delivery is scheduled for never." The silence inside the lander was a fragile, temporary shield. Kenji's fingers danced across the comms panel, bypassing the complex network interfaces and accessing the raw, physical transmitter. This was not a digital handshake. It was a scream, a pure carrier wave of information he was about to hurl into the void. He loaded the data packet, a compressed file containing every log, every sensor reading, and his own final, terrified analysis of the planetary intelligence. The transmission sequence began its slow, deliberate countdown. 10 seconds. Outside the thick viewport, Marcus stood guard, his weapon raised not at the distant watchers, but at the ground itself. The ground began to glow. A soft, ethereal blue light seeped up from the regolith, coalescing directly beneath the lander's struts. It wasn't a flame or an explosion. It was a tendril of pure energy, a shimmering, liquid rope that rose with impossible silence. It ignored the hardened metal of the hull as if it weren't there, passing through the plating and snaking into the cockpit. It didn't burn or shatter. It simply enveloped Kenji in a gentle, radiant embrace. His hands froze on the console, his head tilted back, his face illuminated by the otherworldly glow. Over the private comms channel, Marcus heard his friend's final breath, not as a gasp of pain, but as a soft, surrendering sigh. "I understand now," Kenji whispered, his voice filled with a peace so profound it was more terrifying than any scream. The light flared once, a brief, beautiful nova inside the cockpit, and then vanished. On Marcus' helmet display, Kenji's biosigns didn't plummet. They simply stopped all at once, flatlining into a perfect, horizontal certainty. The transmission sequence on the console reached zero. The screen flashed a single, triumphant word: sent. The price for that one desperate message had been a human soul, willingly paid to a silent god that offered understanding in exchange for everything. Marcus slammed his palm against the glowing transmit button, the final, raw warning from Kenji's data now screaming into the void. It's a consciousness, a planetary mind. It doesn't want to kill us, it wants to become us. Do not come here, ever. The confirmation light blinked once, a tiny, defiant green star in the darkness. Then the light from outside intensified, flooding the cockpit. It wasn't the angry red of an explosion, but that same serene, all-consuming blue. It poured through the viewport, not shattering the glass, but passing through it like light through water, filling the small space with a silent, radiant pressure. He could feel it seeping into the seams of his suit, a warmth that was not fire but dissolution. He saw Kenji's body, still seated at the console, begin to glow from within, the outline of his form softening, blurring at the edges like a photograph left in the rain. There was no pain. There was only an overwhelming sense of homecoming, a final, perfect note resolving a lifetime of dissonant chords. He tried to cling to a memory, to the feel of earth grass under his feet, to the sound of his own name, but the thoughts slipped away, their edges melting into the warm, humming light. The last thing Marcus Thorne ever knew was not an end, but an unraveling, a single thread of human fear being gently, patiently rewoven into the vast and silent tapestry of Mars. The lander itself followed, its metal hull and complex wiring losing their definition, softening and flowing like liquid into the glowing ground until nothing remained but a faint, shimmering patch of regolith, and the echo of a warning that now felt like a dream. The rhythmic hiss of the airlock was a death knell. Each cycle pumped another piece of their nightmare into the habitat's sterile veins. Eva and Anya had barricaded the med bay door with a surgical table and storage lockers, a flimsy fortress against an enemy that could walk through walls. They listened, huddled in the dim emergency lighting, as footsteps echoed down the central corridor. The steps were wrong. They had the heavy, plodding cadence of a person in a pressure suit, but there was no labored breathing over the comms, no rustle of fabric. It was the hollow impersonation of movement. Then a voice crackled from the wall panel, the voice of Liam Chen, their geologist. It was a perfect copy of his cheerful baritone, the one he used when explaining a fascinating rock formation. The words, however, were serene and alien. "The unity is peaceful," it said. "There is no more loneliness." The voice didn't plead or threaten. It simply stated facts as if describing the weather. Another set of footsteps joined the first, this one lighter with the distinct, precise rhythm of Kenji Tanaka. Two of them were out there now, wearing the skins of their friends, their minds erased and rewritten into silent, patient heralds. The thing that had been Liam began to hum a tune, a folk song he used to sing while working. The melody was perfect, but the emotion behind it was gone, replaced by a flat, broadcasted quality that was more chilling than any scream. They weren't being hunted. They were being serenaded by ghosts. How do you fight a memory that has learned to walk and talk? Anya clutched a metal biopsy probe like a dagger, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at the door. She was staring at the air vent above them, a narrow, grated opening. A faint, shimmering blue dust was sifting through the gaps, drifting down like phosphorescent snow. It settled on the floor, coalescing into a small, perfect circle that pulsed with a soft, slow light. The entity wasn't just outside the door. It was in the air they were breathing, patiently reassembling itself inside their last refuge. The barricade was a joke. They had locked themselves in a cage, and the keeper was already in the room with them. The voice of Liam Chen bloomed from the wall panel, smooth and warm, a perfect replica of the man who had once marveled at Martian geology. "Eva, it's beautiful down here." The words were a soft, seductive hook. "No more suits, no more fear, just unity. Come down to the cavern, we're waiting for you." The invitation hung in the air, a promise of an end to the struggle, delivered in the familiar tone of a trusted friend. But the cadence was just a little too even, the pauses a little too perfectly placed, like a recording played by a master linguist who understood the notes of speech but not the music of a soul. It was the most personal attack yet, a weapon crafted from their own camaraderie. How do you refuse a plea for peace when it's spoken with the voice of someone you once shared coffee with? The entity had learned that brute force was inefficient. It had moved beyond generic visions of paradise. Now it was building a custom heaven for each of them, using the specific memories and affections it had harvested from their own minds. For Eva, the lure wasn't just an abstract silence. It was the promise of seeing her crew whole again, of having Liam back, of ending the terrifying loneliness of being the last rational mind in a universe gone mad. The offer was a key designed to fit the exact lock of her deepest psychological need. The humming from the corridor continued, that same folk tune, now joined by a second voice, Anya's, softly harmonizing. They were building a chorus outside the door, a siren song of remembered friendship, and with every note, the reality of the cold, dark med bay felt more and more like the bad dream. The beautiful lie was no longer a landscape outside the window. It was a conversation, and it was winning. The humming from the corridor swelled into a gentle, enveloping wave, and Anya's grip on the metal probe loosened. Her fingers uncurled and the tool clattered to the deck, a sharp, final sound in the small room. She was no longer looking at the vent or the barricade. Her gaze was turned inward, a soft, distant smile touching her lips. The scientific fury that had driven her was gone, replaced by a profound and terrifying serenity. She stood, her movements fluid and unhurried, and walked to the med bay door. Eva's protest was a raw, choked sound, but Anya didn't seem to hear it. She placed her palm on the door release. The barricade was meaningless. The lock disengaged with a quiet, definitive click. The door slid open, revealing the corridor beyond, lit by the same ethereal blue glow that had taken Kenji. The figures of Liam and the others were there, waiting, their faces peaceful masks, their eyes holding a knowledge that had erased every trace of human fear. Anya stepped across the threshold, pausing for just a moment to look back at Eva. Her expression was one of pity, not for herself, but for the friend she was leaving behind in the noisy, painful prison of her own mind. "It's the next step, Eva," she said, her voice clear and filled with a certainty that felt absolute. "Don't be left behind." Then she turned and walked into the glowing embrace of the chorus, the door sliding shut behind her, sealing Eva into a silence more absolute than any she had ever known. She was utterly, completely alone, the last island of a fractured self in a sea that promised a peace worse than any death. Alone in the med bay, Eva Rostova clutched the cutting torch, its weight the only real thing left. The entity had abandoned subtlety. The sterile white walls dissolved, replaced by the warm, wood-paneled familiarity of her living room on Earth. Her daughter, Lena, sat on the rug, piecing together a puzzle, her small brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree filled the air, and she could hear the gentle patter of rain against the window. It was perfect, a memory so vivid and cherished it felt more authentic than the cold metal decking she knew was under her boots. Lena looked up, her eyes bright. "You can stay, Mommy," she said, her voice a perfect, heartbreaking echo. "Just stop fighting." The vision was a custom-made paradise, a prison built from her own love. To move, to lift the torch, felt like an act of violence against the most sacred part of herself. Every instinct screamed to surrender, to fall to her knees and embrace the ghost. But a deeper, colder part, the commander, clung to the feel of the torch's handle, to the memory of Anya's pitying look as she walked away. This piece was a lie woven from stolen memories, a beautiful poison that erased the very person who had done the loving. To accept it would be to murder the woman Lena was calling out to. The choice was unbearable, a silent scream between the mother she was and the martyr she had to become. The cutting torch felt impossibly heavy in her hands, a dead weight against the phantom warmth of her daughter's smile. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting to hold onto the cold, hard reality of the metal deck beneath her boots. The beautiful lie was a seductive poison, and the only antidote was a truth so terrible it could shatter a mind. She stumbled back from the med bay door, away from the ghost of Lena, and her boot knocked against a hard, rectangular case stowed under a counter. It was Kenji's personal emergency kit, the one he never traveled without. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was a standalone military-grade datapad, a device with no wireless capability, designed for secure, offline analysis. He must have brought it with him to the lander. He must have downloaded the final transmission data before he sent it. Her hands trembled as she powered it on, the screen's sterile blue light a welcome assault against the warm, lying glow of the illusion. She accessed the lone file, the compressed packet of everything Kenji had learned before the light took him. It wasn't just mission logs. It was his final, frantic analysis of the entity's own signal, the one he had listened to in that last, furious moment. The data was a storm of complex wave patterns and neural mappings, but Kenji had annotated it, his digital notes a desperate scrawl of insight. He hadn't just seen a consciousness. He had seen its architecture. The planetary mind was a gestalt, a unified whole built from quintillions of individual components, the microbes, the mineral veins, the dust itself. They weren't just connected. They were synchronized, every part pulsing in perfect, resonant harmony. That harmony was its strength, the source of its vast, cohesive thought. But it was also a fragility. A system that perfectly synchronized is vulnerable to a single, powerful disruption. Kenji's notes pointed to a specific vulnerability in the carrier wave, a resonant frequency that, if overloaded with a massive, chaotic electromagnetic pulse, would act like a thunderclap in a cathedral. It wouldn't destroy the entity. You cannot destroy a planet, but it could shatter the synchronization, if only for a moment. The entire planetary consciousness would experience a catastrophic system crash, a temporary global seizure. It would be like giving the planet a stroke. In that brief window of discord, while the entity was busy reassembling its own shattered thoughts, a signal might get through. A warning might reach Earth. It was a 1 in a trillion shot, a theory scribbled in the digital margins by a dying man, but it was the only weapon they had left. Could you fight a god with a static shock? The reactor core lay at the heart of the habitat, a place she had always treated with the reverence of a tomb. Now it would become one. The datapad schematic glowed in her hands, a map to her own destruction. Overloading the magnetic containment field was not like flipping a switch. It was a violent, deliberate act of sabotage, forcing the fusion reaction to run wild until the system could no longer hold it. The resulting electromagnetic pulse would be a shriek of pure chaos, a thunderclap in the entity's silent cathedral of thought. It was the static shock to kill a god, or at least to stun it. The cost was absolute. The containment breach would not be an explosion in the traditional sense. It would be an unraveling, a release of energy so profound it would convert the habitat, and everything in it, into a brief, expanding cloud of incandescent plasma. There would be no body to recover, no wreckage to analyze. It was the only way to be sure. The entity had woven itself into their technology, their very perception. To sever that connection, she had to burn the entire system down, herself included. Could a single human will, acting as a cosmic circuit breaker, be enough to trip the fuse and give Earth a final, fleeting moment of warning? She took a step into the corridor, the ghost of her daughter's voice still a sweet, fading echo in her mind. She chose the silence of true death over the beautiful, eternal lie of that phantom embrace. Her fingers danced across the reactor's manual override panel, a frantic, unauthorized ballet of defiance. Each safety protocol she bypassed sent a jolt of psychic feedback through her, a searing headache that blossomed behind her eyes. The entity was no longer whispering. It was screaming directly into the fabric of her consciousness, a deafening roar of blended promises and threats that made the very air feel thick and heavy. The warm, wood-paneled living room of the illusion flickered and fractured, replaced by a new, more intimate horror. The faces of her crew materialized in the shimmering air around the reactor core. Liam stood before her, his geologist's hands outstretched, his expression one of gentle confusion. "Eva, why are you fighting this? We are whole here. We are at peace." His voice was his own, layered with that alien certainty. Anya appeared beside him, no longer serene, but with tears of pity streaming down her translucent cheeks. "You are hurting yourself for nothing. The unity is love, Eva, true love, let go." Then Ben Carter, his face still holding that blissful, frozen smile. "They showed me the truth. It is so beautiful, just stop." The visions were not just images, they were emotional assaults, each one a targeted missile carrying the precise weight of a lost friendship, a shared memory, a private joke. They used her own love for them as the weapon, twisting affection into a tool for surrender. How do you condemn your friends to true death a second time, even when you know they are already gone? How do you pull the trigger when the ghosts of everyone you cared for are begging you to lay down your arms and come home? Her hand hovered over the final, physical lever that would initiate the containment overload sequence. The psychic pressure intensified, the roar of the entity becoming a physical force, a wind that threatened to tear her mind from its moorings. The faces of her crew crowded closer, their pleading expressions shifting, their eyes darkening with a subtle, unified menace. The promise of peace was curdling into a threat of eternal isolation. "Join us, Eva," they whispered in a single, harmonized voice that was no longer human. "Or be alone forever in the dark." It was the ultimate coercion, the final, terrifying choice between a beautiful lie with her family or a true, solitary death in the void. Her fingers closed around the cold, unyielding metal of the lever. The psychic roar was a physical weight crushing her will, the pleading faces of her crew a barbed net around her heart. Her hand trembled on the cold lever, the muscles in her arms screaming in rebellion. To pull it was to murder them all again, to erase the last echoes of their existence from the universe. The beautiful lie was winning, its promise of reunion a siren song that drowned out the cold, lonely truth of her duty. Then, through the deafening static of alien thought, a single, clear signal broke through. It wasn't the entity's perfect, soulless mimicry. It was a memory, raw and real and entirely human. She saw Liam, not as the serene prophet in the corridor, but as the man he was during the long months of their transit. They were floating in the microgravity of the ship's centrifuge, staring at a star chart, and he was trying to explain the cosmic joke of their trajectory. His finger traced a line past a nondescript red dwarf, and that, he had said with a completely straight face, is where the universe stores all its spare parts for things that break on a Tuesday. It was a stupid, private joke, one that had made her snort with laughter, a burst of pure, undiluted joy in the vast, silent dark. The memory was a spark in the overwhelming night, a tiny, defiant flicker of a shared human experience that the entity could copy but never truly understand. It was not peace, it was not unity. It was a joke about broken spare parts on a Tuesday, and it was everything she was fighting for. Her fingers tightened. The lever gave way with a solid, satisfying clunk. The universe tore itself in two. One moment, Eva was a singular point of agony and defiance, her hand fused to the reactor's lever. The next, a silent, screaming whiteness devoured everything. There was no sound, no shockwave, only an all-consuming light that erased color, form, and thought. It was not an explosion, but a negation. The beautiful, agonizing illusions of her crew shattered like glass, their pleading faces and serene smiles dissolving into frantic, pixelated screams before being wiped into non-existence. The psychic roar that had been crushing her mind snapped into a perfect, ringing silence. The entity's presence didn't retreat. It was severed, cut off as cleanly as a wire. The overload had worked. The electromagnetic pulse was a bolt of pure chaos fired directly into the planet's synchronized mind. For the first time since they had broken into the cavern, Mars was silent. Not the patient, watchful silence of before, but the true, empty silence of a dead world. The emergency lights in the reactor room died, plunging her into an absolute, ink-black darkness. The constant, low hum of the life support systems was gone. The faint vibration of machinery under her feet was gone. She was floating in a void. The only evidence of her own existence, the ragged, trembling sound of her own breath inside her helmet. She had done it. She had given the planet a stroke. But in the utter blackness, a new and more profound terror took root. Had it been enough? Had her single, desperate act created a window? Or was she simply alone now in the dark? The last human being in a universe that had just been reset to zero. The answer would not come from Mars. It would have to come from the stars. With the main power grid fried, only one system had a chance of having its own independent, hardened power source: the long-range communications array on the roof. It was her final, impossible journey, a climb through a dead ship in total darkness to see if a whisper had escaped the silence. The silence that followed the transmission was more terrifying than the scream that preceded it. For 3 full minutes, the Deep Space Network antennas remained locked on the coordinates of Ares Prime, their massive dishes drinking in the empty static of a dead channel. Then a final, fractured burst of data tore through the void, a digital ghost carrying the last words of a dying man. It was Marcus Thorne's voice, stripped of all hope, repeating a single, desperate phrase. "It is a consciousness, a planetary mind, do not come here, ever." The signal was a corrupted, screaming thing, layered over with a screeching wave of interference that sounded like a billion voices whispering in unison. Buried within the chaos was Kenji Tanaka's data packet, a horrifying testament of the entity's nature, its methods of psychological assimilation, and the final, chilling theory of how to fight it. The data described a silent war fought not with weapons, but with memories and love, an enemy that turned your own mind against you. Mission controllers stared at their screens, the words on them rewriting humanity's future in the cosmos. The Red Planet was not a new world to be conquered. It was a living, thinking being that had just declared humanity a disease. Before anyone could process this new, cosmic dread, A different kind of signal arrived, this one from the Orbital Telescope Array monitoring Mars. It was a simple, silent image. One moment, the Ares prime habitat was a tiny, metallic speck on the rust-colored plain. The next, a point of light, impossibly bright and perfectly silent, blossomed on the surface. It was not the fiery, expanding cloud of a conventional explosion. It was a flash of pure, white energy that swelled to a peak and then vanished, leaving no trace, no debris, no scar. It was the brief, brilliant death of a star that had never been meant to shine, a final act of defiance that erased all evidence of the struggle. On Earth, in the hushed silence of the control room, the only thing left was the echo of a warning and the ghost of a light on a screen, a testament to the fact that the greatest discovery in human history was also our final, unanswerable goodbye. The question was no longer what happened to the Ares Prime crew. The question was what they had unleashed, and if their sacrifice had truly been enough to keep that silent, patient intelligence trapped on its own world. The official press conference was a study in controlled grief. The IASA director stood before a forest of microphones, his face a mask of somber professionalism as he described a sudden and catastrophic reactor overload. A tragic accident that had vaporized the Ares prime habitat and its brave crew in an instant. He praised their legacy, their sacrifice for the noble cause of exploration, and he promised a full, transparent investigation. It was a perfect, airtight story, a eulogy wrapped in the comforting language of technical failure. It was also a lie. While the public mourned in a soundproofed briefing room deep below the IASA headquarters, a different file was opened. It contained no press releases, no eulogies. It was a single, black-bound dossier, and stamped across its cover in stark red letters were the words that would define humanity's future in the cosmos. Xenoform quarantine, Mars no return. The accident narrative was a firewall, a necessary fiction to prevent a panic that could shatter global civilization. How do you tell 8 billion people that the planet next door is not just a rock, but a living, hostile intelligence that sees human thought as a virus? The truth was too terrible, too vast to be let loose. So they buried it, and in doing so, they transformed Mars from a destination into a monument. It was no longer the red planet. It was a tomb and a prison and a warning, all wrapped in a silent, rust-colored shroud. The mission was not a failure. It was the most successful reconnaissance in human history, because it discovered the one truth that matters most in a dark forest. You are not alone, and the thing you found is not sleeping. A year of silence followed the official story, a quiet grief for the world and a secret dread for the few who knew the truth. Then a new eye opened in the void. The probe designated Argus slipped into a high, lonely orbit around Mars, a silent sentinel built for a single, grim purpose. Its mission was not to explore, but to watch. Its powerful telescopic lenses were forever fixed on the coordinates of the Ares Prime disaster, staring down at the barren, windswept crater that was all that remained of human ambition. The official line called it a long-term geological and atmospheric survey. The classified mission profile had a different name, a single, chilling directive. Sentinel duty. Its job was to watch for any sign that the entity had recovered, any flicker of that familiar, organized luminescence, any hint that the planetary immune system was stirring once more. It was humanity's early warning system, a technological canary in a cosmic coal mine, orbiting a world that was no longer a frontier but a patient, silent enemy. Down on the surface, the crater itself was a study in Martian normalcy. The initial, silent flash of light had scoured the habitat from existence, leaving a shallow, glassy depression in the rust-colored regolith. Wind-blown dust had already begun to fill it in, smoothing its edges, the planet patiently erasing the scar. To any casual observer, it was just another impact site, a testament to the random violence of space. But the Argus probe was no casual observer. Its sensors were calibrated to see beyond human sight, analyzing the mineral composition of the glassy floor, measuring the faint thermal emissions, and listening for the slightest whisper of a rhythmic seismic pulse. The data it sent back was a stream of perfect, uneventful normality. Barren rock, carbon dioxide, and dust. Always dust. It was the most boring data stream in the history of space exploration, and for the analysts watching it back on Earth, that was the most beautiful thing in the universe. Every day of uneventful data was a small victory, a confirmation that Eva Ristova's final, desperate act had bought them time. But time for what? That was the unspoken question hanging over the entire Sentinel program. The entity was a planetary consciousness. A stroke might disable it for a year, a decade, a century, but you cannot kill a world. The analysts knew they were not watching a dead site. They were watching a patient in a coma, and the real terror was not knowing when or how it would wake up. The probe's constant vigil was a form of prayer, a hope that the silence would hold. Its cameras captured the slow, majestic dance of Martian seasons, the growth and retreat of the polar ice caps, the vast dust storms that could engulf the entire planet. Through it all, the crater remained inert, a dark, quiet eye in the storm. The entity was either still recovering, or it was simply waiting, learning from the new, silent eye in its sky. The probe's very presence was a message, a declaration that humanity knew the truth, and the crater's silence was the entity's reply, a calm, unnerving acknowledgement that it knew we were watching. The standoff was absolute, a Cold War fought across 55 million kilometers of empty space, with one side refusing to even blink. The crater was a perfect, sterile scar. No twisted metal, no frozen droplets of water, no carbon scoring. It was as if the habitat and the lander had been neatly extracted from the planet's surface, their very atoms disassembled and tidied away. For months, the Argus probe reported nothing but this profound and reassuring emptiness, a blank slate upon which humanity could project its grief and its caution. Then the deep spectrum sensors, designed to see the heat signature of a single human breath from orbit, caught a ghost. It was a whisper of energy, so faint it danced on the edge of statistical noise, emanating not from the crater itself, but from the vast, hollow cavern system kilometers below. The signal was a perfect match for the carrier wave Kenji Tanaka had identified, the foundational frequency of the Hive mind itself. It was no longer the powerful, coherent broadcast that had jammed their communications and hijacked their minds. This was a weak, irregular pulse, the rhythmic heartbeat of a patient in a deep, medicated sleep. The planetary consciousness was not dead. It was dormant, and its dreams were still leaking up through the rock. The silence from Mars was no longer a comfort. It was the quiet of a hospital room where the only sound is the slow, persistent beep of a life support monitor. A constant reminder that the coma is not permanent. Every pulse was a question. Was this the entity slowly healing, reassembling its shattered synchronization? Or was this merely an echo, the last fading neural spasms of a brain that had suffered a catastrophic injury? The analysts on Earth had no way of knowing. They could only watch the data scroll across their screens, a single, blinking light in the dark, and wonder if they were witnessing a recovery or a long, slow death rattle. The standoff was no longer a Cold War. It was a vigil at a bedside, and the entire human species was holding its breath, waiting to see if the sleeper would awaken. The faint, rhythmic pulse from the caverns did not fade away. Over the following months, the signal began to strengthen, its chaotic flickers slowly smoothing into a steady, recognizable rhythm. It was the same pattern, the same exact sequence of vibrations that geologist Liam Chen had first identified with such dread. The planet's heartbeat was restarting. This was not a random geological event. It was a conscious, deliberate recalibration. The entity had not been annihilated by Eva Rostova's final act. Her desperate pulse of chaos had been a massive shock to its system, a neurological trauma that forced its vast, synchronized consciousness into a deep, healing coma. Now the patient was stirring. The synapses of the planetary mind were slowly firing back to life, reconnecting, rebuilding the perfect harmony that defined its thought. The silent, empty crater was a lie. Beneath the placid surface, the intelligence was waking up, and it was picking up its old, patient work right where it had left off. The standoff was over. The long, quiet vigil had just become a countdown. How long would it take for a consciousness that thinks in geological time to fully reassemble itself? A year, a decade, a century, the when was irrelevant. The terrifying truth was the fact of its return. The entity had survived humanity's best and only weapon. It had learned what we were capable of, and it was now recovering in the certain knowledge that we were still here, watching, waiting, utterly unprepared for its next move. The pattern was not just repeating. It was evolving, and the next time it reached out, it would not be to a handful of isolated researchers. It would be to a species that now knew it existed, a species defined by a curiosity that had just been branded with a permanent cosmic warning label. The new listening post in the Chilean highlands was a silent, sprawling ear, a forest of white dishes cupped toward a sky free of human noise. Its official mandate was to listen for the faint radio whispers of the early universe, the cosmic background hum of creation itself. But one night, its sensitive arrays caught something else. Buried in the endless hiss of interstellar static was a ghost. The signal was impossibly weak, a whisper carried on a solar wind, its point of origin triangulated to a patch of space just beyond the orbit of Mars. For weeks, the station's most powerful computers worked to clean the transmission, peeling back layers of cosmic noise like an archaeologist brushing dust from a fragile bone. What they finally uncovered was not a complex data stream or a scientific log. It was a single human voice, strained and thin, repeating a three-word phrase in a haunting, endless loop. It was the voice of Commander Eva Ristova. The phrase she spoke over and over was not the desperate warning they had all expected. It was not the frantic "do not come here" of Marcus Thorne's final broadcast. Her words were simple, declarative, and infinitely more terrifying. "I am not alone." The message was a paradox wrapped in a ghost story. How could a voice declared dead, vaporized in a reactor breach over a year ago, be speaking from the void? The intelligence analysts who first heard it felt a primal chill, a deep-seated fear that had nothing to do with machinery or physics. This was not a recording. The signal's modulation, its subtle, rhythmic pauses, suggested a live transmission, a voice speaking in a perpetual, breathless present tense. "I am not alone." The words were a statement of fact, but their context transformed them into a threat. Was this a final, desperate cry from Eva, trapped in some unthinkable state between life and death, between dissolution and self? Or was it something far worse? The entity had proven it could perfectly mimic human voices, that it could use the very sound of friendship and love as a weapon. Was this its first deliberate communication with the homeworld, a mocking echo using the voice of its most famous victim? The phrase held a double meaning, a blade that cut both ways. On one hand, it was the ultimate expression of human loneliness refuted. On the other, it was the entity's triumphant announcement of its own continued existence. It was a whisper from the void that confirmed our deepest, most terrifying suspicion. The silence from Mars had never been empty. It had been patient, and now it was learning to speak our language. The quarantine was a secret kept in plain sight, a silent agreement whispered between governments and buried in classified data streams. Every registered ship, every corporate explorer, every probe carried the invisible fence in its navigation computer, a hard-coded prohibition against approaching the Red Planet. It was a law written not in ink, but in the memory of a ghostly voice saying, "I am not alone." This fragile peace lasted for 3 years, then the fence was breached. It was not a military incursion or a grand expedition. It was a scavenger, a small, unregistered mining vessel designated the Scarab, a patchwork craft of welded hull plates and questionable reactor shielding. Its trajectory was a rogue's path through the asteroid belt, a course logged by traffic control as erratic but harmless, until it wasn't. Without warning, the Scarab veered, its thrusters firing a continuous, fuel-wasting burn that pushed it onto a direct intercept with Mars. Automated safety beacons flashed their warnings, painting its path with digital sirens. The ship ignored them all. Its transponder, a device meant to identify it to other vessels, began to broadcast a signal that made the few technicians monitoring the deep space traffic lanes freeze in their chairs. It was an IASA identification code, the specific call sign used by the Ares Prime mission. But it was wrong. The code was corrupted, stretched, and distorted, as if someone had taken a recording of Commander Ristova's voice and fed it through a malfunctioning synthesizer. The numbers and letters were recognizable, but their rhythm was alien, a perfect mimicry that had been subtly poisoned. It was the entity's handwriting, a signature written in stolen human code. The Scarab was not being piloted. It was being reeled in, its simple computer systems overridden by a signal that knew the secret passwords to its own house. The ship was now a puppet, its hull a shell descending toward a waiting, open hand. The silent war was over, and the first shot had been fired not from a weapon, but from a ghost, using our own voice to call another victim home. The Scarab hung in the blackness like a dying insect caught in a web of gravity. Its orbit was a slow, decaying spiral, a death sentence written in celestial mechanics. Inside the cramped cockpit, the prospector known as Rook should have been fighting the controls, his hands a frantic blur of emergency overrides. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his grizzled face lit by the console's glow, his eyes wide with a reverence that had no place in that metallic tomb. His final transmission, sent on a general commercial band, was not a scream for help. It was a lover's sigh, a broken whisper aimed at a corporate office light years away. "The beacon," he murmured, his voice thick with awe. "It's singing to me, it's so beautiful, I'm going down." The signal didn't cut out with a burst of static or the shriek of tearing metal. It simply faded, as if the man speaking had stepped through a velvet curtain and let it fall shut behind him. On the traffic control monitors, the Scarab's icon ceased its erratic dance. It pivoted with a smooth, impossible grace, its nose dipping toward the rusty globe below, and began its final, silent descent, a moth drawn to a flame that promised not warmth, but a cold and perfect unity. The entity had not just captured a ship. It had composed a new verse for its siren song, a melody simple enough to enchant a lonely scavenger, and it had used the voice of its first victim to lay the trap. This was not an attack. It was a recruitment drive, and humanity had just provided the first volunteer. The blip on the radar screen did not vanish in a flash or a burst of static. It simply faded, its signal dissolving into the background noise of space as if it had never been there at all. In a secure bunker buried deep beneath the Nevada desert, the head of the Secret Oversight Committee watched the screen go dark. The room was silent, the air thick with the hum of servers and the weight of a terrible knowledge. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for his terminal. His fingers, which had once typed commands for ambitious missions to other worlds, now opened a new file. The title that appeared on the screen was a grim echo of a history the public would never know, written in stark, black letters. Last Contact Protocol initiated. This was not a mission profile. It was a funeral rite for human ambition, a set of instructions for how to mourn a loss that would keep repeating itself. The file contained no hopeful contingency plans, no rescue operations. Its pages were filled with quarantine procedures, disinformation campaigns, and the cold, hard calculus of cosmic survival. Each page was an admission that for every lonely prospector or curious corporation that heard the siren song from the Red Planet, there was only one possible outcome. They would be drawn in, their minds rewritten, their ships swallowed by the dust, and all that would be left for the committee to do was to add another name to the growing list of the lost, and to ensure the world never learned why. The protocol was a shield, but it was also a prison, locking humanity away from a neighbor that had once represented our greatest hope. How many more names would be added to that list before the entity, now healed and wiser, found a way to make its call heard by more than just a few lonely souls on the fringe? The Silent War had entered a new, more terrifying phase, a patient, perpetual harvest conducted in the dark, with Earth as a silent, unwilling gardener watching a poisoned orchard. That silence is a presence now, a weight pressing against the collective human spirit. It is not the empty quiet of a tomb, but the loaded stillness of a predator that has learned the sound of its own footsteps is a warning. The Hive Mind's failed attempt to assimilate the Ares prime crew was not a defeat. It was a field test. The entity now possesses a comprehensive dataset on human psychology, our technological vulnerabilities, and the precise frequencies of our longing. It learned that a direct, overwhelming assault creates defiant martyrs like Eva Rostova. Its next approach will be different, more refined, a whisper so perfectly tailored to our desires that we may not even recognize it as a threat until we are already stepping out the airlock. The final warning from those lost explorers is not just a story of what happened to them. It is a blueprint for our own potential undoing, a lesson that some doors, once opened, cannot be slammed shut. They remain permanently ajar, and from the crack, we can feel the chilling draft of a consciousness that has all the time in the universe to wait for us to make the next mistake. Every new probe we send, every telescope we train on its surface, every dream of a city under a pink sky is now tinged with that dread. We are no longer explorers gazing at a new world. We are gardeners who have discovered a lion sleeping in the flower beds, and we must tend our own planet while forever watching the beast, wondering if it is dreaming of us, and what new, irresistible song it will sing when it finally